So I'm a female living alone in a fairly safe apartment complex. I live on the 5th floor, and on my floor there's only my apartment, my neighbours, and a laundry room with a washer and a dryer. I know most of the tenants in my building, except for my neighbour. He's only been living here for like a week. I only know his name, but never really talked to him. I only know that he's an older guy from talking to another neighbour. Anyway, so at around 8 tonight, somebody rang my doorbell. Through the peephole, I saw a guy standing in front of my door, mid-40s I would guess. I thought that's probably my neighbour. It's actually quite normal in our complex to go and introduce yourself, so I thought that's what he was trying to do. I only opened the door a bit, because you never know, right, and left the chain on. He saw me, smiled, and said, "Hi," but didn't say anything after that. I was already a bit confused, so I just sort of said, "Hi, how can I help?" He introduced himself as Bruno, didn't say that he was my neighbour or anything like that. I didn't say anything either, to be honest. And after a few seconds, he said, "Don't be afraid, I don't bite." I was ready to yeet the door closed because, what the heck, right? If somebody tells you to not be afraid of him, there's definitely something to be cautious about. But before I could close it, he came really close to the door and almost squeezing his head in the gap. I knew that I should have slammed the door in his face at that point, but I was just kind of, shocked or something. But before I could do anything too, he asked, "Did you do this to my laundry?" And I was like, "What?" He repeated, "Did you do this to my laundry?" And at that point, I was super confused. Like, what was he talking about? I told him that I don't know what he's talking about, and he said something along the lines of, "Well, come and have a look," and pointed to the laundry room. And at that point, I just noped out and slammed the door shut, double-locked it, and called my boyfriend. I saw the guy stand in front of my door for at least another minute through the peephole before he left down the stairs. He didn't seem angry or anything, he just sort of had this weird blank expression on his face. My boyfriend drove to my place immediately. He checked for cars outside the complex, checked the stairwell, but he couldn't find the guy anywhere. We went to look for the laundry that he was talking about, but when I got there wasn't any. And I know that he didn't take it with him because I saw him leave without any and looked through the peephole the whole time until my boyfriend arrived. He asked me if I knew the guy or anything, and I told him that initially I thought that it was my neighbor, but wasn't sure. He went and rang my neighbor's doorbell, and I watched him through the door, and the guy that opened definitely was not the guy that rang my doorbell. He also didn't know anyone that matched the description. And even though he hasn't lived here for that long, it still wasn't very reassuring. Honestly though, this whole thing just creeps me out so much. Like, what would have happened if I went with this guy into the laundry room? What was he doing up here? Why target my room? Why target my apartment? I don't know, but by the way, in my country, your surname is printed on the doorbell, but not the first name, so I don't know how he knew my name, and the whole thing is just really weird. What do you guys think I should do? Years ago, I moved to follow my boyfriend and to do a PhD in his country. I won't name the place, but it's an across-the-ocean type of deal. At first, I was very excited. It was a wonderful adventure. That is, until it wasn't. It's hard to describe the complexity of what I felt. I felt alone, misunderstood, far from my family and friends, and even though my boyfriend is wonderful, I really felt the weight of not finding any human connection. This could explain why I acted so weird and disconnected from reality in the following story. I'm also a very naive woman, and I like to see the best in people around me. This has been problematic more than a few times, but this story is maybe the worst example of where this candid attitude got me. So my boyfriend and I, we're into BDSM. We do it alone, on our own, and do not participate in events or anything. I do have an account on an own website. I go there to find new ideas for our sessions, and I sometimes, but rarely, post pictures. No face, no tattoos, nothing like that. I get contacted by interested DOMs once in a while, even though I clearly state that I'm not free. Usually they send copy-paste messages, so I just ignore them. Once in a while, though, I'd get a more, personal message and make an effort to answer that I'm definitely not interested and that I'm in a relationship. And this is how my discussion with him started. He didn't approach me with, will you be my sub, but with curiosity about how I got into BDSM, stating that he was quite new to the domain and was interested in understanding the way of life. So, I gladly explained. Explanations turned into discussions, and he told me about how he was in the police and that he investigated drug cartels. He also told me that he was married and that he had kids. Interestingly, we had a lot of hobbies in common too, a lot. I won't go into details about those hobbies, but they're kind of specific. And feeling very lonely, combined with the fact that I felt like I could trust him because he was married and had kids, I accepted his invitation to start texting on WhatsApp. I want to be clear that my boyfriend knew about this from day one too. Plus, we had been talking on this website for almost 3 months before switching to WhatsApp. He was very friendly and interested by my day-to-day life. He'd share pictures of his kids and of investigations that he was working on. This went on for another 3 months too. Then, one day, he told me that he had to do an interview of a suspect close to the town where I lived and asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, and we met for the first time. Before anyone panics, my boyfriend was hiking with friends for a few weeks. I texted him, but he didn't have a signal. Plus, we have a very trusting relationship. He has a lot of girlfriends, and back in my country, I hung out with a lot of boys, so this really isn't weird for us. But anyway, back to this first encounter. It felt as if we had known each other for years, to be honest. We had a great time from the beginning, and I was so happy that I'd found a friend far from my country, and he knew that I loved reading thrillers and enjoyed murder investigation videos, so he showed me his gear. Handcuffs, sampling kits for small investigations, other restraints, etc. It didn't feel weird at that moment, but afterwards, I kind of understood that this could have been a way for him to show off what he could do. However, as the night went on, after grabbing drinks from a nearby bar, he forced me against a wall and kissed me. I was shocked, really, and barely managed to push him off me. I told him that it was completely inappropriate, that he was married, and that I was in a relationship. He was really sorry and felt ashamed. He told me that he felt that there was something between us, and I was like, yeah, it's called friendship. I was disappointed, to say the least, and we parted ways. Days later, after he apologized over and over again, he called me to meet up. He wanted to take me for a ride in his hometown. It's a pretty place. He's got a bike and he wants me to enjoy the scenery in his country that I barely know. And I agree. It is his hometown. He works there. He lives there with his wife and kids. Surely I'll be okay. In short, I wasn't. Again, he kissed me, tried to push for more, in the middle of a park, mind you. A park where he brought his children to play on the weekends. So I told him to bring me back to the bus station so I could leave. He did, and then proceeded to tell me a story about how he had recently got a drug seller out of hiding by modifying text messages sent by his girlfriend. He basically made him believe that she was cheating on him to get him to confront her and then arrested him. I don't know if it was true, I don't even know if it's possible, but due to what had just happened, what I heard was, I can make your boyfriend believe that you're cheating on him. And my boyfriend was still on his hike by that time. We did talk once every few days, and I told him everything about the moment that he had some cell signal. Meanwhile, I was confronting this guy about that. His behavior was really strange as he went from, I'm sorry, I think I'm in love with you, to, if you tell the cops, who do you think they'll believe? their colleague or an immigrant? I got scared and tried to cool things down with him. I just felt that he could go crazy at any moment. He clearly wasn't used to girls refusing him. At that point, I thought that it would be safer for me and my boyfriend to maintain contact with this guy, albeit with less enthusiasm than before. But after understanding how obsessed he was, I blocked him from all platforms where I knew that he had an account. But he found me. He even sent me my address, asking if I'd loved living in that particular part of town, and I never gave him my address. I guess that he could pull some strings at the station to get my info. He even came to visit me at my job at one point. I was so scared that I just played it as if everything was okay. I told him my boyfriend wanted me to cut ties with him because he was angry about what had happened, which was true, but I also wanted him out of my life. I didn't know how he would react if I told him, however. This guy insisted that I loved him, though, that I could be his mistress, that my boyfriend didn't have to know. He was obsessed by me, and he didn't hide it anymore. He told me that he wanted to have me, how we'd be a great couple, how he'd father our children. He went from I'll be husband material to, like, a serial sex offender too in a matter of seconds. I refused again and again, blocking him, changing my accounts, you name it. I got scared, though, when I got calls from unknown numbers. I was terrified when I saw anyone slowing down on a motorcycle close to my apartment. I was wary of going outside and going to my job. The quarantine was actually pretty welcome for me, really, and I didn't get any news from him for months. And then I broke my cell phone, and I knew that I could transfer all of my numbers from one phone to another, but I didn't know that it would unblock previously blocked numbers. Days later, I got a message from him. He told me that he had divorced his wife, that he still loved me, that he wanted to marry me. He apologized for making me believe that I was only mistress material and that I was worth so much more. He said my boyfriend didn't love me, that I deserved better, that he was waiting for me. When he saw that I saw his message, he said, "Finally, I thought you'd never unblock me." So, does this mean that he'd been sending this message over and over again in hopes that I'd finally see it? This narcissistic man used all of the manipulation tactics that he knew. He had told me before we met in person how he had learned those skills to toy with criminals, to have them tell the truth and admit crimes. Fortunately, I had dated manipulative men before and knew the signs. Basically, he wasn't used to not getting what he wanted. He was attractive, rich, interesting, and he knew that. I blocked him again, and we moved a few months later, and I just hope that he doesn't get his hand on this information. I believe that his last move was trying to hack into my Instagram, as I got a notification that someone from his hometown had tried to connect to my account. This obsessed cop who has chased me for over a year now, it's terrifying, to say the least. So this was earlier this year. I moved to a different town and was finally settled into my new place. It was the night before Christmas and family was coming by early that morning, so I spent the evening cleaning and prepping for the next day. All was well, I was in high spirits and crawled into bed. It was the first time that I was hosting Christmas, so I was a bit too anxious and giddy to fall asleep. I knew that I should sleep soon, but I was just wide awake, so I played on my phone a bit and just passed the time. It was about maybe 10 p.m. or so. But then suddenly, I'm in the car with my husband on the highway and he's pointing at something in the sky, frantically yelling, "What is that?" And the next thing I know is that I'm groggy and waking up and there's lights around me and a dark shadow, and it feels like there's fingers pressing my temples and something is on my head. I vividly remember that feeling of dread and thinking, oh no, not again. I feel groggy but managed to mumble and lift my arm, which was heavy, and tried to say, "I'm awake." I then just closed my eyes and wanted it to be over with, and I remember thinking, I hope this doesn't last long. Suddenly there's blackness and I snap awake. I'm drenched in sweat. There are 2 points on my forehead that are throbbing in pain. I'm in my bedroom again, and everything as I left it. The TV is on, my phone is in my hand, and I'm thinking, man, that was a weird dream. Suddenly there's a loud noise and the power shuts off, leaving me in the dark. It scared me half to death as well, and I jumped up and tried to wake my husband, who was dead asleep. Finally, after a few seconds though, the power was back on, and my husband thinks that I'm just silly. The thing is that I understand that it could very much have been just a dream. That's not impossible, I suppose, but I'm not much of a dreamer, and if I do, they aren't that vivid. This one just felt so real, but why? And why aliens of all things? I'm mostly into ghostly stories, so I don't read or look up UFO stuff that much, and I remember the physical feeling of dread that it was happening again, and I could feel my stomach drop, and I felt sick when I thought, not this again. But the strange thing is that I don't recall any other dreams or experiences like this. It's just so random. It was Christmas too, so I definitely wasn't thinking about aliens or anything. Anyway, I don't know what to think of any of this. I guess I'm just sharing it to get it off my chest and reaching out, I suppose. So, if you have any idea about what any of this could be, then please do let me know. I live in a 3-story, 4-bedroom new build house. Prior to it being a house, this plot of land was a residential home. Before that, I have no idea. So, myself and my partner and our young children have lived here since it was built, nearly 6 years. I've never felt anything bad or good in this house, except for the bedroom on the top floor. That bedroom was our youngest's bedroom. That was her bedroom from about maybe 6 months old until 2 years. But she just never slept well, ever. She would always wake up during the night, sometimes crying uncontrollably. We just put it down to her being a terrible sleeper. However, sometimes if we couldn't settle her back down, we'd bring her into our room, which was directly next to the said bedroom, and she would just sit and stare into the hallway outside, and would refuse to be put down near the doorway. And if we tried to carry her out into the hallway to show her nothing was there, she would freak out. She no longer has that room as a bedroom. She shares with her older sisters now. The middle child, our boy, now has that bedroom, and he claims to feel fine in there. However, when it was our youngest bedroom, when she'd wake in the night, my partner would always go downstairs to make her a bottle, and I would go in and comfort her. And while comforting her with my back to the door, I would always, feel like there was something or someone watching me. Anyway, that's the backstory, but during a conversation that we were having as a family tonight, myself and my partner were talking to the eldest boy, 15-year-old, and our youngest just so happened to sleep in her brother's room last night. He was at a sleepover at a friend's house, and she wanted to escape the younger ones, but we asked her how she slept. It was a totally normal question, mind you. We certainly didn't lead her answer or anything. It was one of those, how did you sleep last night sort of questions. We weren't prodding for anything, is what I mean. And she said, well, not so great. I felt on edge, like someone was watching me from the doorway. I wasn't scared, but I felt anxious. And how she described her feeling was exactly how I felt in the past when I would often be in there comforting our youngest. Neither my partner nor myself have ever spoken to the children about this before, so there's no way that she was just regurgitating what we've said. But man, I felt a shiver go up my spine when my stepdaughter said this tonight because it was so accurate. My partner even immediately looked at me as if to say, wow, that's exactly what we've said. Anyway, I just wanted to share my story and see if anybody else can relate. A friend has just recommended that we invest in some selenite to place in and around the room. But does anybody else have any other suggestions? And am I just overthinking this, or is there something more to it? In autumn of 1995, when I was 5 years old, my parents moved us from suburban Dublin to a small town in a neighbouring county. Nowadays, that area would almost be considered suburban, but back then, it was the middle of nowhere, right before Ireland's economy started to really boom too. They bought a house that was about 2 kilometres from the village in a field surrounded on all sides by farmland, with a little cowshed directly touching the edge of our land. It had a long driveway up to the house, a 3-bedroom 1900s dormer bungalow, and as a suburban kid, I hated the place as soon as we moved there. My parents were into their late 20s, early 30s at that time. They both had grown up in the city and wanted to experience country life, so it was an opportunity to do a renovation. And when we moved into the place, it was rancid. Nobody had lived in this house for decades, and I remember the water running yellow from the taps and the kitchen being non-existent when we moved in, and the heating wasn't installed yet. On our first Saturday there, I remember we watched what I think was Goldeneye. Could have been a trailer for it that I remember. I was only like 5, so it's a little bit fuzzy. We watched it though beside an electric heater with duvets around a tiny TV. What I'm trying to say is that it was bleak at first. As it moved into winter though, my parents were renovating room by room, and I experienced my first memorable snowstorm. Our electricity went out at one point, and I do remember my mum trying to keep me chill while she lit candles and stuff. And over time, things did eventually get better, and they renovated the upstairs room first. But when you walked up the stairs, there was one big room that we all put our beds into that connected to an attic space, which I remember helping my dad put rat traps in and that sticky bug tape onto. Anyway, over time they renovated all the rooms in the house, and it turned out really nice in the end. It was very 90s, with loads of bright colours and a country kitchen and all that. But my mother was really depressed there, and this was a time before the internet took off, and in Ireland at that time, once you left the cities, you only had like 3 channels, and they were all Irish, which in 1995 was not a good thing. She just felt isolated, I guess, and I remember a few times she let me take the day off school and stay home even. I think that she did this because she was lonely though. Anyway, in August of 1996, they gave up and moved us back to the city. They bought a really nice brand new home right before house prices skyrocketed, and I even got to rejoin the class that I had spent a couple of months with in 1995. In 2011, when I was 21, my dad and I went for a drive together and decided to drive back to that town. And he started telling me stories about that house, and suddenly a bunch of experience that I'd had suddenly made a lot of sense. So, remember that big room upstairs? My whole life, I've had this sort of reoccurring dream where I'm lying in bed, my parents are downstairs with my family over, and as I close my eyes, I can see shadows moving in front of me between the hanging lights and the bed, as if someone is sort of walking back and forth in front of me. And I've had that dream maybe 20 times, I would guess. My dad told me that one of the major reasons they left was because they felt the place was actually haunted, apparently. This was obviously news to me, but my mum was already depressed being alone there while he commuted into the city every day, but that she also had experiences that made it very difficult for her to be alone by herself. But both of them had also experienced the shadows and the lights, apparently, and he told me that once she was brushing her teeth in the downstairs bathroom and sort of felt a cold sensation, and then the back of her robe was pulled so hard that she dropped her toothbrush. But the bit that really freaked her out, apparently, was me talking to myself. My sister had been freaked out by this too. One night, and I remember this clear as day as well, my parents had friends over and I was playing in my bedroom, now downstairs, and I had an 80s arcade machine in my room that my dad had gotten somewhere. You didn't need to put change into it to make it work, but I remember very clearly that I was with a girl who wanted to know how it worked and stuff. And something happened, and she convinced me to get some change and try to force it in. I went to my mum and lied and told her that I needed £1 for the charity box school that they had given me. She gave it to me, and me and the girl tried to slot it in. My mum came in at one point, and she was really mad at me, because obviously I'd lied to her. I told her that the girl told me to, and my memory gets a bit foggy after that, but my dad in the car that night told me that there never was any girl apparently, and that wasn't the first time that I'd seen her. The other time, I was playing in the front garden at the gate, and my dad noticed me talking to myself. He came over and told him. He came over, and apparently I told him, I'm just talking to the girl. And I do remember him being like, okay, that's nice, and not making a sort of big deal about it again, that there was no girl. One time when they weren't looking and I was with her, she actually touched me for the first time. And this is the only time that I remember that I really thought as a kid that something was strange. She sort of touched my hand and then just immediately disappeared. I mean, I was 5 and I didn't know what had happened, but one minute she was there and the next she was gone, and I had this incredible need to take off the t-shirt that I was wearing. It felt like that feeling when you know that there's a spider on you or something. I ran up to the house though and into my room and pulled my clothes off, stomping on them. My mum noticed this too, but I really don't remember anything after that. Anyway, the old house, the smells of rotten eggs and the birds constantly flying into the windows were creepy enough without all of that too, but it apparently really sunk in with my dad when he was at the mechanics in town one day, making small talk, and one of the lads said, "You're brave living in that place," because apparently it had been abandoned for years and had been known locally as a very creepy spot that people would stop and look into on the country walks and stuff, wondering about it. When we eventually got back to it on our drive, the place was once again abandoned and being used solely for storage by whoever bought it, I think. It still looks creepy to today, and the travelers or gypsies who bought it have put a big religious shrine in front of the house. But there were also big sort of beech trees surrounding it, and it had a proper gate and all that, but 25 years haven't been kind to it, that's for sure. When I was 18 or 19, I decided to go metal detecting this park that was in the heart of the ghetto. Saying that this place is in a bad part of town too is really an understatement. There are regular shootings that occur at it, and the parking lot around the area is filled to the brim with dirty needles. And maybe I was stupid for detecting at this location, but I guess I just didn't care. I mean, I'd previously hit the spot and helped this old bum find a missing piece from his bicycle. But anyway, when I went here this time, it was like 4:30 in the morning. I drank like 8 cups of coffee and had this beat-up, rusty 1980s bounty hunter metal detector that my grandpa got at Radio Shack and left to me when he passed away. And I started on one side of the field and began moving across it in a sort of rust-a-scan sort of pattern. I found mainly just Corona caps, pennies, and sprinkler parts in the end, but I was at about the middle of the field and got a hit that seemed like it could have been a dollar coin or a ring or something, so I started digging it. I dropped my detector on the grass and pulled out this really big knife that I had to start cutting a plug, and as I was digging, I sort of looked around me every few minutes to keep a good view of my surroundings. At one moment, I looked behind me and noticed that this older, heavy-set black dude, sort of looked a bit like Wesley Willis, who was super far away from me, was starting to get a bit closer. I assumed that he was just a guy at the park, so I kept digging, but kept my eyes on him. It's worth noting too that he couldn't have seen my knife from the angle that he was at, just my detector and bag of findings. He started getting closer and closer to me, and I got really suspicious at this point. I started wondering what his deal was, and I don't think that he saw I noticed him, because just then he started charging me, like running full force towards me as fast as he could, with his eyes aimed at my gear. I stood up as fast as I could, and he saw my knife and immediately yelled, "Oh man, I didn't mean any trouble. I'm sorry man," and then just ran away super fast. To be honest, I was more confused by the situation than startled, I guess, but I still got out of there pretty quickly because that, after a little bit of reflection, could have been a very close call. So I'll start by saying that my family is no stranger to weird paranormal happenings. I may share more about those as I remember them fully, but this is meant to be more of a detailed explanation of a situation that I've shared previously. So I'll only be listing the things that I believe are related. During the winter of 2009, there was a big snowstorm that hit my small Oklahoma town. If you know how the southern states deal with snow, then you understand that this is a pretty big deal. The snowstorm knocked out the power off and on over the period of a few days, I think. And this instance happened when the storm first hit. So my brother, my girlfriend at the time, a couple of friends and I had pretty much been snowed in. The power was hanging in there at this point. I had made my daughter some chicken nuggets for dinner and she was sitting in her high chair just eating them. She had been eating for a few minutes when she sort of stiffened in a silent scream and stared onto the long hall that reached the length of my house. Instantly, the energy in the house had changed too. There was almost a buzzing in the air, if that's the right way to put it. But my friend, my brother and I jumped up and we put ourselves between the girls and whatever had scared my daughter like this. After she saw something, she thrashed her chicken nuggets off of the high chair, trying to get out, so my then girlfriend grabbed her and was now holding her. We could all feel something looking at us. We assumed maybe someone had walked through the back door at the end of the hall, but we couldn't see anything. Then my daughter started to scream, crying, "Adderman," over and over. Now, the friend that was there with us was actually a skeptic. He didn't believe in anything paranormal up until this incident, but the buzz in the air finally died down. We asked my daughter about what she saw, and the best that she could tell us through baby talk was that it looked like Daddy with long wet hair like Mummy. Obviously, it wasn't that clear, but I'm translating from a toddler, a little kid. But this was just the start. A few days later, my daughter started having nightmares about what she called the blue eyes. The best that we could gather was that this was a group of kids and all she could see was their blue eyes. One night, I woke up from a deep sleep and I saw someone standing behind my fan. They were kind of hunched over, looking between the blades. Then I suddenly heard my daughter start crying at the top of her lungs. The figure quickly dusted away, and I use the word dusted because it was like the person just sort of came apart. Normally, I would assume that this was just a lucid dream or something, but my daughter happened to cry in the middle of it, right at that point. I don't know. I jumped up to check on her, though, and as soon as she saw me, she said, "The blue eyes made the baby on fire." And this was word for word, minus the baby talk. At this point, I reached out to a family friend. She made me a bag to sew into my daughter's teddy bear, and I did it. My daughter's nightmares stopped, and we didn't have any more related incidents after that, too. Myself and the girlfriend broke up a few years later, and I moved to Texas and had some roommates, but only had visitation with my daughter. Nothing that happened ever seemed as if it was related to the earlier incidences, so I pretty much forgot about it. In this house in Texas, I started having issues with sleep paralysis, though. I would occasionally wake up and see a big pair of chattering teeth in my closet, and wouldn't be able to move. Eventually, I would always doze back off, but it was freaky. I've told other people before that at first I never thought that it bothered my stepson, but upon speaking about it to my wife last night, she thinks that it may have. A few years after the sleep paralysis, my wife and my stepson came into my life. My stepson would often have nightmares, but one night he complained of being scared to sleep. This is normal because he's only 3, but we asked him why and he told us, "There are scary teeth in my closet." I know not necessarily related, but I thought that it was worth mentioning. Years after that, though, we now have a 3-year-old girl. She's very smart and advanced, pretty fast with her speech, so she was pretty much understandable just before her 2nd birthday. And she has always had issues with sleep. She started telling her things about a baby scaring her when she was sleeping. A little while later, she started talking to us about random things. And one day, she's riding in a car seat, and she tells us that she saw me last night, but I was apparently a spirit. She starts referring to this spirit as Spirit Daddy, and apparently she follows Spirit Daddy around the house as he and his friends with blue eyes go into each of her siblings' rooms and jump and play. They crawl on the walls and play on the beds, then go to the next room and do the same thing. And then they run and hide until next time. So, two of my children have described me as some kind of a spirit with long hair coming and interacting with them. The Spirit Daddy also apparently has friends that have blue eyes and are kids. For the record too, this isn't like a family legend that we talk about or anything. After the first occurrence, there was a kind of hush order on the Adder Man. We just didn't want repeats or for the kids to have nightmares when they were older. So, if you've made it this far, then thanks for listening, and I don't know. I just wanted to see what everyone thinks about my case now that it's happening again. Maybe you can help me figure it out, what it is that is. Anyway, thanks for listening, and hopefully I can figure this out soon. This happened almost a decade ago when I was 13 years old. I remember my friend and I were excited about our first time trick-or-treating without our parents, and we lived in a small town where nothing ever happens, and so we thought that it would be the same that night. It started like any other Halloween night. We collected candy, ran into many of my classmates, and we had a lot of fun. At 8 p.m. we realized that we had to head home, but on the way back we dropped by our teacher's house. She wasn't home and the street didn't have many street lights. To add to this too, most of the houses had their lights turned off and their Halloween decorations were taken down. My friend and I were slightly spooked and disappointed by the lack of candy. We wanted to get out of the street as soon as we could, and that's when a man emerged from under one of the few street lights. But thankfully, it was a police officer. Neither of us seemed to notice him before this, possibly due to the darkness. He startled us, but seemed very friendly. The cop introduced himself and pointed to an inconspicuous bungalow. He said an older man living in this house was inviting trick-or-treaters inside. Someone called the police, but when he arrived, no one was answering the door. He kept telling us his police car and partner were just around the block. We looked around, but we couldn't see them. Now, I was a pretty paranoid kid when I was young. Growing up, my mum loved watching crime shows, and she would always tell me tidbits of lessons. One of these was a story about fake cops. Although I don't remember the details, I remembered people can pretend to be police officers to gain trust. Throughout this whole exchange, too, I was just terrified for some reason. Maybe it was his lack of badge or police car and partner. Whatever it was, though, it just didn't feel right. I was also conflicted because he was smiling and seemed like he just wanted to help. That was until we heard his strange request. He said that he needed to speak to his potential predator and needed our help. And since we were young girls, the man would answer if we knocked. The officer claimed that he would hide behind the bushes next to the front door. He would wait for him to invite us in, jump out, and catch him red-handed. And at that moment, I knew my friend felt the same way that I did. We both fell silent, but one of us managed to ask if we could discuss it. The cop said yes, but told us that we had limited time. The street was silent, and he could hear everything. I remember the feeling of wanting to say something, but fearing that he would hear us and escalate the situation. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. The cop was getting increasingly impatient and told us that we had to decide quickly. Around that moment, a family came down the street and noticed the officer. They were coming over to see what was happening, and that's when the cop said that he'd be right back and to not go anywhere. My friend and I scrambled to collect our thoughts, and we ended up just deciding to run away quickly. We sprinted our way down the street and we didn't look back. On our way home, we discussed theories that ranged from him being a fake cop, him playing a prank on us, or him being a real cop, but we just misunderstood the situation. When we told our parents, we downplayed it a lot and doubted our experience. In the end, we didn't call the police, but our dads drove to the house and the area around the house, but no cop cars or police officers were anywhere in sight. Over the years, I can say that I do regret not calling the cops. At the time, my friend and I were just convinced that we misunderstood what happened. We even told our class the next day, and most, including our teacher, thought that it wasn't alarming. But looking back, I find it extremely strange that a police officer would put two children in such a potentially dangerous situation, moreover with their parents not present. And I wonder what his motives really were, but unfortunately, that will probably remain unsolved. So I'm going to preface this by stating that the information I'm about to share with you guys is not fiction. It is in fact my complete and honest recollection of the unexplained experiences I observed in and around the wooded area behind my childhood home. Other people in my family noted much of the same while growing up there, and our stories match now that we're all decades older. I'm not saying that I believe in skinwalkers, Sasquatches, or any other cryptids, as I'm a man of science, but I cannot ignore the lack of reliable and testable evidence in regards to such creatures actually existing. That being said, something very terrifying and unexplained lived or lives in the woods behind that house. So the first occurrence, my sister and I had just received a tent as a gift from our grandfather. He had smoked enough Marlboro cigarettes and sent in the UPCs to get us a massive Marlboro tent. My mum hated it, but we, however, loved it and immediately set it up on the property line behind the house. We intended on spending the night out there, but after about an hour or so, we experienced something neither of us can explain to this day. We saw an indentation drag itself across the tent, and heard it dragging as it went. It was like a giant finger, or maybe a log or something. Something of that size at least. My sister cried out, and I immediately bolted outside as I was convinced that it was our father playing a prank on us. Upon exiting the tent, I was greeted by nothing, though. There was nothing there. I searched the area briefly too before grabbing my sister, and we went inside for the evening. About a week later, I ventured out to the tent again, only to realize that it was gone. I ran inside and asked my mother where the tent was, and she replied that she had thrown it away because it had tears in it. Confused, I tried to convince myself that she was lying and she had tossed it out because she was anti-smoking and thought the tent looked really trashy, but I fear that she was telling the truth. The second occurrence was one fall morning, about an hour before my alarm went off for school. I was jolted out of bed by what I can only describe was an otherworldly shriek. It came from the woods, definitely. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound quite animal either. Foxes and coyotes live in those woods, but they don't make those kinds of sounds. I can definitely tell the difference after living there for so long, but it was insanely loud too, and then it just stopped. And that was it. The third occurrence was one evening my father and I were up late having one of our classic all-night arguments. As we finally wrapped up our night around 3 a.m., my father said that he wanted to read a verse from the Bible in order to close on a positive note of peace. As he began to read aloud, that same, or at least very similar, otherworldly shriek boomed throughout the house. It had to be just outside of the kitchen window, but it was so loud that it almost sounded like it was actually inside the house. We immediately ran around the house trying to find what the heck had made such a sound, and it even woke my siblings and my mother up, who helped in the confused search. After about half an hour of searching, we eventually just all sort of gave up and went to bed scratching our heads. The fourth occurrence was in my senior year of high school. I actually got a cat around this time. She was an outside cat, but we would let her into the garage to sleep every night, mostly due to the coyotes and potentially bad weather and whatnot. She would always come home before we shut the garage doors, though, because she didn't want to be locked out. And one night, she just didn't show up. I didn't think too much of it, as cats are sometimes known to go on long hunting or mating excursions, only to return like 2 or 3 days later, like nothing even happened. And I just assumed that was the case. But after not seeing her for like a week, I went and explored the area behind my house, the fields, and of course the woods, and I think that I found her. I say I think because I honestly couldn't tell. It looked like her, but she'd been seemingly just turned inside out. I stared at the remains for about a minute before turning back and just going home. And after that, I never did see her again. If you can shed any light on what kind of animal or being or whatever you might think this is, then please don't hesitate to share or speculate. My family, especially myself, I'll admit, would really love to know what exactly was in those woods. This incident happened to me about maybe 8 years ago now, I think, but it still freaks me out to this day. I was about 19 or 20 years old at the time, and I'm a female. It was a Sunday night, and I took the bus to go to the movie theater, which was about half an hour away. In my city, the bus schedule on a Sunday is pretty terrible, and they stop running pretty early. But I arrived at my bus stop, which was a large station surrounded by a fence with a couple of openings here and there, which lead to a path, and I would always take this path to go home and cut through a school football field before getting to my street. It was only about a 10-minute walk home. It was dark outside, but not very late, maybe 9 p.m. or so. As I was walking toward one of the openings to get into the path, I noticed 2 pairs of eyes on the other side of the fence staring at me. My stomach dropped, and my gut told me that something wasn't right. I kept walking straight instead of going onto the path so that I was still under the bright bus station lights. As I walked past the eyes, I realized that it was actually 2 men standing behind the fence, just watching me. They were dressed in dark clothes, which is why I couldn't really see them very well. But as I walked past them, they started yelling at me like, "Why are you walking alone at night? Where's your man to keep you safe? Come here, girl." They were laughing and began to follow me. I pulled out my cell phone, and it was at like 2% battery. I held it in my hand in case I needed to call for help, and as I sped, they sped up and started yelling threats to me. Threats involving rape. There was no one around, and obviously I was terrified. I saw one bus coming around the loop about to leave the station to start a route, so I just ran as fast as I could toward that bus. The 2 men were chasing me at this point. I made it to the side of the bus as it was driving, and I began banging on the window, frantically yelling stop. The bus driver, thank God, stopped the bus and opened the door to let me on. I told him to shut the door quickly, and I pointed toward the men that had turned around and were walking back the other direction. At this point, I just broke down. I was shaking uncontrollably, and I was in tears. The bus driver parked the bus and called for the transit security to come. I used what was left of my phone battery to call my brother for some comfort. The security drove me the rest of the way home, and they followed the bus the 2 men got on. Unfortunately, the men got off at some point, and they just booked it though. And although they were never found, I am just so thankful for that one last bus ride, or else I really don't know what would have happened to me. This story happened around 4 years ago when I was 15 years old and we just moved into this house. We live in a very small tourist town, school like K to 12 in one building, and population of like 700, and not during tourist season, kind of small. There was this weird druggie too that everyone just sort of knew of and hated. He lived in one of his parents' houses and didn't pay rent, so they decided to kick him out. My parents were actually friends with this family and helped take care of his kids when he couldn't, so we were on pretty good terms. They gave the druggie, I'll just call him D for short, 30 days to move out for failing to pay a single rent check in his miserable life. We weren't doing very well at all financially too, and needed somewhere to stay or rent. We began talking to Dee's parents about the house, and they said that we could begin renting it as soon as he moves out. The 30-day mark came around, and we asked Dee if he was ready, and he acted like he knew nothing about what we were talking about. His parents said that they were just going to give him some extra days and help him move his stuff, so we waited another month. At this point, the current place that we were staying at, we had to move out in a few days. We went to the house and went inside to see all of Dee's stuff was still in the same spot. We decided that we couldn't wait any longer at this point, and we just bagged his stuff up and told him to pick it up at some point. Fast forward about a year, we always heard scurrying like mice and stuff in the ceiling, but we have a ton of strange animals like mice, snakes, lizards, all sorts of stuff here. One of our 4 snakes went missing from its closed tank with clips holding down the lid, so it could have been that. But there were no holes anywhere to be found. We didn't think anything of it, to be honest, but it was a bit strange. Eventually, though, we started hearing louder sounds, and our dad said that it was just the house settling. The stuff was disappearing from the fridge, electrical bills went up, we smelled smoke at one point. Us kids got blamed for all of it, and we even had our phones and my PC taken away. But the power bill was still up, and that was strange. And I also got blamed for the smoking in the house, which my parents had no reason to believe or prompt this accusation, so I was actually grounded until graduation. I was mad now too because I did not smoke in our house, ever. Now, I was unbelievably bored one day, not being able to do anything, so I decided that day that I was going to go and explore the attic. I opened the door and, oh my goodness, my mum then came right up the ladder ready to beat me and saw it too. A bed, a microwave, a mini fridge, cigarettes, unsmoked blunts, everything. And I guess by now that you probably know exactly who put them there. It was the druggie. He then came back that night through my little sister's window. He was higher than I've ever seen anyone before and admitted to a bunch of stuff, and we recorded it. He had actually taken the snake and let it loose to get rid of the mice. He was the one smoking in our house. He snuck in through my little sister's room every night. And in court, he then admitted to making a small hole in the floor of the attic to watch my 11-year-old sister sleep at night. We changed all the locks and we got a Ring doorbell, placed higher security locks on all the windows, and even more stuff than that too. But the worst part of all of this was that this creep only got 6 months probation for marijuana possession, which wasn't yet legal in my state, but, I mean, come on, after all of that, that's all he gets? At some point he got 1 year of prison for breaking and entering for an entire year almost every day, but, I don't know, the system here is just broken. He did have to pay a pretty heavy fine for damages, and also had to pay us back a year's worth of electrical bills, but again, it just wasn't enough in my mind. We are now out of debt, and my parents are living steadily because he finally finished paying all fines to us. Unfortunately, though, my sister had to go to a therapist twice a week, and I don't know, she might never get a good night's sleep ever again after that. So my daughter, 2 years old when this started, talks about seeing things in the mirror in her room. At first, we figured that it was just make-believe, but then it got a little more weird. I'll share some of the details below, but my question for you is, what's the best way to deal with this? So So one day, she was in her crib, which is right by a wall that is mostly mirror, 2 mirror doors and a sliding closet. She pointed at the mirror and she asked me, "Do you see the doggy, Daddy?" I was confused. I asked her if she meant her stuffed dog, one of the few different stuffed animals, but it was not currently in sight. She insisted, "No, in the mirror," and kept pointing as though a dog was sitting right by the mirror, or inside of it. At the time, we used to turn on red lights as a nightlight for her, and she said he likes the red lights, and in her garbled way, she also said he comes and sits when you go away. Now, we read to her a lot, but she doesn't watch much in terms of videos or TV. She speaks well for her age, but she doesn't generally make up stories. And I'll admit that I was a little spooked, but she didn't seem to be afraid, so we just put her to bed like normal, and we just went about our night. I did mention it to my wife, but again, we just didn't think too much of it. About an hour after she fell asleep, though, she woke up absolutely screaming, pretty unusual for her, and not just crying too, but screaming and really distressed. She seemed to be saying no, no, no as well. We watched in the monitor for a bit, wondering if we should go in, and then my wife gasped and my heart skipped a beat because we actually saw something. It looked like 2 white lights chasing each other through the air. My wife later said that she thought that somebody was in the room because she saw a foot. We bolted in there though, obviously, and we turned on the lights. My daughter was crying uncontrollably, and when she calmed down, she wouldn't say anything, but she did look traumatized. Just sort of staring at the wall, maybe. We moved her crib into our room for the night and felt really disturbed by the whole thing. I've thought about it a lot, and I can't figure out how those lights could have appeared in the room the way they did. We've seen dust floating and glowing, but this was a lot different. The next day I asked her about it, and she said that it was a wolf. I have no idea where she got the idea of a wolf from. There's nothing like that in the books that we read to her. But then she said the little one was there and the big wolf came and they fought. She had never said anything like this before, especially about fighting. But in the end, we couldn't really get anything else out of her about it. She just never brought it up again. However, she has mentioned a few times that there is a man in the mirror. She said that he talks to me a lot. She also often insists on showing things to the mirror. For instance, once we put her in a new dress and she said, "I have to show the mirror." So I held her up in the bathroom mirror, but she insisted this mirror wasn't the one that she wanted. She wanted to show the mirror in her room. Once she found a little ornament of a dog and said, "I show this to the mirror," and ran into the room. And she came right back out and said, "No dogs. The mirror says no dogs." Last night she was calling to us after we put her down and asking us to protect her, just casually sing-saying without fear, "Mommy, Daddy, protect me." So we came in and asked what she meant, and she said, "There's a lion," and pointed to the mirror. So we sort of played along and shooed it away, which made her smile and get back into bed. It was now a toddler bed. She'd been in there for a few weeks too. I was a bit on edge because of the dog thing in the past being a precursor to weirdness. But anyhow, I'm up working, wife goes to bed. An hour later, I hear a thump, and my daughter starts crying loudly. I rush in, and she had fallen out of her bed. I'll happily admit that maybe it was just a coincidence, but she's never fallen out before. Today I asked her too if we should cover the mirror up with a curtain or something, and she actually said yes, that it's scary sometimes. She said that she saw a monster once, but then she said we can open the curtain sometimes to say hello. I asked her who we would say hello to, and she said Mr. Wolf. She doesn't seem to be scared of Mr. Wolf, but she also said that he's not nice. Anyway, obviously I have no idea what to make of any of this really, but I sure would appreciate if somebody could point out to me some resources or something to approach the subject with, because this whole situation is strange. to say the least. This was back in November of 2018 and takes place in North Carolina. I was 14 at the time. My family and I had just moved across states. We'd just gotten into the city where we planned on living after a long road trip. We were all hungry, so decided to go to grab some dinner before we went back up to pick up the keys to our new house. We went to this local pizza shop, and since we had our dogs with us, because we hadn't moved into our house yet, we decided to eat in the car. I'm a pretty fast eater compared to the rest of my family anyway, so I finished way before they did. After I was done, I decided to bring my puppy out to do her business. We were just standing there a little ways up from the car, playing in the leaves on the ground. I actually grew up in Florida, so I wasn't used to seeing piles of autumn leaves like that. So I was just living my best life, not paying attention to my surroundings, when a man all of a sudden taps me on the shoulder. My dog notices him and immediately tries to jump on him, as she does with anyone, so I pull her back while I'm backing away from him. He looks to be in his mid-40s, 50s maybe. He smiles creepily at me like it was forced. He says in this scruffy southern voice, "You have my dog, my border collie." Immediately, a red flag goes off in my mind as my dog looks very obviously like a boxer, nothing like a border collie. Now, let me tell you too that I am horrible at confrontation, so I just say nervously, "I think you're mistaken, sir. This is my dog." Not even telling him that my dog does not look anything like what he was describing. I look over to my parents' car that was just a couple of feet away, unsure of what to do next. They hadn't even noticed the man approach me, and they were, I think, on their phones. The man now asks me, "Well, would you be able to come and help me look for my dog?" I can feel my stomach drop in that moment. I still didn't want to cause a scene though, as I'm probably just overreacting, but I have read my fair share of kidnapping and sex trafficking horror stories, so I have an idea in the back of my mind on what's going to go down. He then says something along the lines of, "I have some money in my truck for you," if I went with him, that was. My hands are sweating at this point, because this is something straight out of a Reddit thread. He points over to a very sketchy, rundown-looking truck. I tell him that I'm busy and I have to go, but best of luck with finding the dog, right? I was still trying to keep him on my good side, but looking back on it now, I don't know why I didn't tell him my parents were right there. If I would have, I think he may have backed off. I overly worry about what others might think, so I was just trying to be polite, I think, and not make him mad. But out of nowhere, he then decides to grab my dog's leash and say that he had dog treats at his truck and starts to walk away with my dog. I pull the leash away from him and say sternly, "I have to go now." As I start walking away, he then grabs my wrist and rips the leash out of my hands, throwing it to the ground. He starts pulling me in with him, mumbling something like, "Just come and see what I have for you." My dog, the sweet good girl that she is, follows after us and starts barking. While he starts to drag me with him, I am pretty small, 5'4", and have no upper body strength, so I just start screaming to let go of me. My parents, alarmed, hearing me scream and our dog chasing after me barking, see this man pulling their daughter against her will, and they immediately start sprinting after me. I start screaming, "Mum and Dad!" And I think that he got alarmed when he heard me yell out "Mum," as she starts running towards us. The sudden realization that my parents were right there in their car the whole time, he makes a run for it, and we didn't run after him. My parents were just glad that they had me. This is definitely not a good way to start off your new life in North Carolina, right? Not even having lived there for a day yet. I don't wish this to ever happen to anyone, as it was honestly terrifying. But my advice for you is this. Don't ever be afraid to use your words, even if they offend the person, because right there and then is not the time to worry about what others might think. So me and my friend and my girlfriend were staying on top of a small mountain in a yurt in North Carolina for 3 days. The yurt was one large cylindrical room with 2 futons and a kitchen table. 2 doors enter the yurt off of a porch that circled one half of the building. The first door was to the north and the second door to the west. The second door was closer to the futons, and the main entrance was on the north from the futons. So, the first night we made dinner and we fell asleep after our 9-hour drive, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. We went out hiking in the morning and we had a full day, lots of fun. We came back and I made a dinner and we just pretty much passed out. But that night my girlfriend woke up and had an extreme and sudden notion that the doors needed to be locked. So she got up and locked the door and went back to sleep. She claims too that she woke up again in a sort of sleepy daze to what looked like a black silhouette sitting at the dinner table next to the bed. She just shook it off though as a dream or maybe a sleepy hallucination, and she just went back to sleep. We went out again on our 3rd day hiking and returned at about sundown. I actually wanted to take a time-lapse of the sun retreating over the mountains, so I ran up to the top of a little hill to set up a time-lapse aimed down at the yurt. And as I was doing this, my girlfriend and my other friend were exploring a trail that led back into the woods of the mountain. We all went back in and I left the camera shooting. I made dinner and we ate, and after I went up to the top of the hill alone to retrieve my camera, this is where things started for me. So I took a quick leak by my tripod, and as soon as I finished, this wave of what I can only really explain as energy enveloped me. I all of a sudden had this image in my mind of something behind me in the woods slowly approaching me, like a wall of fog or something. In my mind, I kept having this image of a strange white figure that could have been like a humanoid tree kneeling by the ground and standing up, then sitting, only to repeat the action multiple times. I know that this sounds weird, and it was all just in my head, but it was like I could pinpoint where the idea was. A little freaked out, I grabbed my stuff and I just went in for the night. We all fell asleep pretty quickly, and in the middle of the night, I awake to a huge bang on wood that sounded like the north doors were being hit. I was really tired and looked around, and neither my girlfriend or my friend on the futon 5 feet away were awake. So I just sort of look around for a bit, shrug it off, and eventually fall back to sleep. I continue to have dreams as if my vision was just floating inside the yurt, slowly panning along the inner wall looking outside of the windows for hours. Like I was standing inside of the yurt walking around, but I had no body and there was no sound of me walking. And then I awake again to a huge bang at the other door just 6 feet away from the futon. Since my body is oriented towards it, I open my eyes quickly and I was immediately fixated at the door, which had a full glass window with a shade. I watched intently too, looking to see someone or anything, but there was nothing. In my head, I remember saying, "This is messed up," and I shut my eyes and I went back to bed. Hours pass and I wake a 3rd time. This time I was on my side and didn't open my eyes though. But to my horror, I can hear a voice just outside. It was a sort of inflection more than words though. It spoke in a way like a person speaking to another though. I had this notion that there were 2 of whatever it was. I was obviously petrified, and I looked real quick to see the clock at 5:30 a.m. I once again said, "This is messed up" to myself, and eventually I just laid there and fell back to sleep. Eventually, when we woke up, I went over to talk to my friend, and I said to them that I don't want to alarm you, but I was hearing some really messed up stuff last night. And both my friend and my girlfriend said that they had also awoken to the huge bangs. The weird thing, though, is that when each one of us heard the noises and woke up, we each saw that all the others were asleep. I cannot specifically remember exactly what grade I was in, but I do remember that I was in middle school. I remember this detail because when this event took place, I was with someone that was only my friend during my middle school years. After that, my friend moved away and we lost touch. And this story takes place on the outskirts of St. Louis, Missouri, during the 1980s. For reference too, we will call the friend that I was with Amy. So it had been a fun day with Amy. My mum had dropped us off at the mall where we had been wandering around window shopping and trying on clothes and stuff. This was a very tiny mall in a small town on the outskirts of St. Louis. Because this mall was so tiny too, it didn't actually have a lot of restaurants or a food court or anything. However, there was a McDonald's across the way. To get there faster too, you could cut through a field that was in between the mall parking lot and a street. Once you cut across that field and crossed the road, McDonald's was pretty much right there. So, Amy and I went to McDonald's, ordered our food, and we sat down. We were eating our ice cream and just sort of chatting away when a man walked in and sat down at the table in front of ours. The way that we were sitting put Amy's back to him, but left me facing his direction. And almost immediately, I began to get a really uneasy feeling because not only did this man not order anything to eat, but he just sat there the entire time staring at me with the angriest look on his face. He wasn't even trying to hide it too, the fact that he was just staring. I also remember that he had these piercing eyes that were bright blue. Keep in mind too that this was before cell phones were abundant, so calling my mum wasn't really an option. And being as young as I was, it never really occurred to me in my childlike mind that I should maybe get the attention of an adult working there or ask to use the phone. All I could remember thinking was this scary man was making me feel really uncomfortable. But eventually, Amy and I finished our food and our ice cream. I had used her head to obstruct the man's view of my face and whispered to her what he was doing. I also told her that if he followed us out, that we needed to run. And sure enough, as soon as we got up to leave, so did he. We rushed out the door as fast as we could, then we began to sprint. I looked behind me and he was getting into one of those boat-sized cars that were made in like the 70s or early 80s. Luckily for us, there wasn't much traffic and we were able to cross the street before he had a chance to even get to us. When we got to the field, I turned around to look to see where he was again. Before I go any further too, let me note that next to the field was the street that ran horizontally, the one that we had crossed, and then to the left of the field, there was another street that ran vertically. That street intersected with the one that we had to cross, so the field was basically in the corner of these streets, if you catch my drift. The street to the left didn't run in a perfectly straight line though, it ran in a sort of diagonal direction that would eventually take you to the mall parking lot. And this was good too, because when I had turned around again, I could see that he was actually watching to see where we were going. Next, he turned into the street to the left of us and was driving really fast. He was definitely coming for us, and like I said, the street that ran diagonally took him in the direction away from us, but would eventually have us end up in the same parking lot. And it was very obvious that he was trying to get to the mall parking lot before we could get there, because the road that he was on went away from us, and we were shortcutting it through the field, plus running as fast as we could. We were able to get inside of the mall, thankfully, before he could catch us, but I think that we got very, very lucky. Once we got inside of the mall, though, we frantically ran up to the security guard and told him what had happened. Shockingly enough, too, he blew our story off as an exaggerated tale from two dramatic middle school children. Things were much different back then. Today, if young kids approached an adult with a story like that, the police would be called right away, I suppose, and a description of the man and his vehicle would be taken. Even worse than that, though, when Amy and I told my mother the story, she just blew it off as well. My mother was emotionally neglectful and definitely was not the best parent growing up. I had serious trust issues towards adults growing up because of many situations like this. I never felt protected by the people that should have listened and also kept me safe. I felt alone and unheard. This event being an important reason too that I felt that way, but Anyway, I digress. So fast forward a few days ago, and my husband was watching a YouTube video about serial killers. And I stopped dead in my tracks because as he was watching it, a familiar picture popped up on that video. One of the people or the pictures of the men mentioned in this video was the same man from that McDonald's. I am 99% certain that it was him too, and his name was Tommy Lynn Sells. Now, let me add too that I have an excellent memory and I'm definitely a visual learner. I suck at names, but never forget faces. I can even remember a few people and events from when I was like only 3 years old. But this was such a scary event that I never forgot that man's face, or the angry look that radiated off of him. It definitely stayed engraved in my young mind, and there is no doubt in my mind that that man was evil. My husband already knew my story, and when I told him that I thought that that was the man who attempted to kidnap me, he was a bit skeptical at first. So, together we decided to do a little further research on this guy. And what came next only solidified what I suspected. Tommy Lynn Sells was killing people, sometimes young girls my age, and he was indeed killing people in the St. Louis area during that time. He was also working at carnivals and was traveling, killing other people in other states. Like most serial killers, though, he didn't have a type. Anyone he could get his hands on was pretty much fair game. He just liked the rush of killing. But what made this even creepier was the mall that Amy and I were at had a carnival going on every summer in the parking lot on the other side of where we were. I can't really remember what month it was when this happened, but I do remember the weather was really hot. Which means that I'm relatively positive that it was summertime. I wonder, too, if maybe he was working for that carnival? The picture of him on Wikipedia is exactly what the man at McDonald's looked like, that's for sure, even down to the same evil, angry look. And I, for one, will never forget that expression. Now, I've been mulling over and over this ever since. I don't know if I should contact the FBI with my story. Though he was executed in 2014, LE knows of 22 murders that he committed, but they suspect that there are many, many more. And who knows, my story might just place him in an area someone disappeared from, but I don't know how helpful it would actually be considering that I can't remember the exact month or year. And to be honest, I don't even know if I would be believed. What do you guys think I should do? This took place 20 years ago when I was 12 years old. Almost all of the details were kept from me at the time, I think due to my age, so I didn't find out until much later what actually took place. My mother, understandably, still doesn't really like talking about any of this, as it was a really traumatic experience. It's only with hindsight that I've realized how genuinely creepy and horrific this whole situation was. Anyway, in early 2000, I had just started high school. We lived a little ways away from school, so my mother used to drop me off in the mornings and pick me up in the afternoons. On the 15th of February that year, I headed to meet my mum at the usual pickup point across the road from my school, but I was surprised to find my grandmother waiting for me there instead. My grandmother told me that my mum wasn't able to pick me up, so I went with her and we picked up my brother from his primary school. But my sisters were both away on school trips. We went back to my grandparents' house, and my nana and my grandfather sat us down to tell us that something terrible had happened. That our mum's close friend, Vivian, had died the previous day. They didn't go into any details, other than that mum was obviously extremely upset. We were upset too, to be honest. I mean, Vivian was a lovely lady, and we had spent a lot of time at her house over the years. Not only because Vivian and my mum were close, but also because Vivian's husband, Andrew, was my brother's Club Scout leader, and one of their sons was my brother's friend. At that age, though, nobody that I knew had ever really died, so it was quite difficult to process what had happened. We'd only just seen her the previous weekend, in fact. From my perspective as a naive 12-year-old, the following days passed mostly without incident, apart from my mother's obvious sadness. In hindsight, there was also an air of disquiet around her, but I didn't really clock it at the time. Around 2 weeks after Vivian's death, I was at home with my mother and my brother while my stepfather, a barista, was out for dinner with a client. It was early evening, maybe like 7 p.m., and I believe my older sister was at her boyfriend's house while my younger sister was at basketball practice. Our house has a large open-plan L-shaped room which encompassed the kitchen, living room, and the dining room areas. My brother was playing in his bedroom while I was sitting on the couch just watching TV in the living room area with my mum. From that vantage point, too, I had a clear view of the front door, but the security light on our front porch flickered on, and there was a knock at my door. My mother got up to answer it, and as she opened the door, she took a step backwards and visibly stiffened. Vivian's husband, Andrew, was standing on our porch, asking to see my stepfather. I remember my mum explaining that my stepdad wasn't available to talk at the moment, and that if Andrew needed to speak to him, then it would be better to leave a message. Andrew clearly realized that my stepdad wasn't home and insisted on waiting for him. My mum repeated that it would be better to call another time, but he easily sidestepped her into the house and strode straight into the living room area. I can still picture my mother's forced cheeriness and frozen smile as he sat down on the couch opposite mine and asked for a cup of tea while he waited. Mum, still with that strange smile plastered on her face, asked me to make tea while she told V's husband that she called to find out what time my stepdad would be home. I made tea for all three of us, and I sat back down on the couch, making awkward small talk with him while my mum repeatedly dialed my stepdad's mobile number, but he wasn't answering. Andrew was talking to me, but I remember thinking that it was rude that he didn't seem to be paying any attention to what I was saying. His eyes were constantly flickering over to my mum, who was standing at the phone in the kitchen area around 5 meters away from us. The whole thing just felt very weird to me at the time. But she eventually got through to my stepdad and, still smiling, said something along the lines of, "Oh, darling, Andrew is here. Yes, here, in the living room. Yes, yes, he said that he's waiting for you. You won't be long, will you?" My stepdad was home within like 20 minutes and convinced Andrew to leave with promises that they would speak on the phone the following day. Now, I found out years later that my mother, stepfather, and the rest of their friends, along with Vivian's parents and brothers, all strongly suspected that Andrew had actually murdered Vivian. My siblings and I didn't attend the funeral. My mum felt that we were too young, I think anyway, but I later discovered that a police presence was needed at Vivian's funeral, which Andrew attended, because Vivian's brothers were so angry that there were concerns that they may assault Andrew, as they were convinced that he had actually murdered her. That's how intensely people suspected him. Obviously, my mum was utterly terrified when he showed up at our door that night, but had been desperately trying to both not to antagonize him nor to frighten me. It had actually transpired that he had been interviewed by the police earlier that day, and it was clear that they were building a case against him. He wanted legal advice and potential representation from my stepfather, who in the end refused. Now, according to my mum, Vivian and Andrew had been having marital problems for a long time, and Vivian had confided in my mum and others that she had felt increasingly uncomfortable around him, and that his temper could be frightening for both her and their children. They were already sleeping in separate bedrooms, but he didn't seem to be accepting that the marriage was all but over. The previous weekend, she had told my mum and others that she was planning to officially leave him, and that she was going to be making it clear to him that it was over too. She was bludgeoned to death with a steel rod in her bedroom on Valentine's Day when she returned home from dropping her boys off at school, having supposedly interrupted a burglary, though the police immediately realized that it was obviously staged. The contents of drawers from the bedside tables and the chest of drawers had been emptied out in piles onto the floor, but there was no indication that these piles had been sifted through. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen. My mum, and others for that matter, believed that she had potentially rejected some form of romantic gesture and he'd snapped. However, there was blood on the piles of drawer contents, but no blood on the floor underneath, which suggests that the burglary may have been staged before she even returned home that morning. Andrew tried to cover up his crime by deliberately driving to a series of shops and obtaining receipts for small purchases and making inquiries with cashiers to build an alibi. He also originally claimed that he had visited a large shopping mall on the day of the murder and walked around there for quite some time. But 2 weeks later, presumably when he realized that the police could check CCTV and find that he wasn't there, he changed his story and said that he'd actually been at a very popular local nature reserve walking and reading a book. Conveniently, there is no CCTV in any part of that particular nature reserve, including the car park. But he was not seen by any other walkers in the area that day. He had actually come to our house that evening after admitting earlier that day that he had initially lied about his whereabouts to the police. And he was arrested soon after. Andrew has never admitted to the murder, but was found guilty on circumstantial evidence. He was sentenced to 21 years with a minimum term of 16 years, meaning that he may already be out on parole. I can't find any information about that online, however, and I don't want to ask my mum about it, as I don't want to drag up awful memories for her. Oh, and a few years later, Andrew also went through a phase of writing letters to my younger brother, who would have been around 11 or 12 years old at that stage, from prison, protesting his innocence. And that gives me the creeps. So last Friday, I was home alone, and at around 11 p.m. I was watching some YouTube videos or something up in my room when I heard a knock at my door. I knew nobody was supposed to be over, so I just ignored it. But they then started ringing on my doorbell, so I got up and I went to the front door. Now, there's usually a light at my front door that's on, but it seemed to be burned out all of a sudden. But even in the dim of the light, I could see that it was two kids who looked no older than 8. I opened the first door and I asked the kids what they're doing, and it was a boy and a girl. The girl asked, "May we come in and use your phone? We got lost and we can't find our way back home." And I mean, it was 2 kids, so I think anyone would say yes, right? But something just felt wrong and I couldn't figure out what it was, and I still don't know why I didn't let them in. But the light at the front porch then flickered on for maybe a second or two, and when I looked at the kids, I could see that their eyes were completely pitch black. I took a step back and I slammed the door shut, locking it. They kept banging on the door for maybe 5 minutes, and it sounded like the door was about to fly off the hinges any second, but then all of a sudden it just stopped. I looked out of the house windows, but I couldn't see anyone, and I think that they must have left. I didn't get any sleep that night, and to be honest, I've been struggling to sleep ever since then. So I just graduated from boot camp. While I was there, some strange things happened that me and some other recruits could not explain, and, well, I've come here to look for some answers. So, here's the story. When you're in boot camp, you have to stand watch occasionally for like a few hours. I was usually put on watch at night. Me and my partner usually stood watch from midnight to around 2 a.m. My job was usually roving security, which is basically the person who patrols a set area and takes temperatures, readings and whatnot, and looks for suspicious activity and stuff like that. Usually, the most serious things I dealt with were other recruits messing around in the bathrooms and telling them to go back to their bunks. One night, around 2 a.m, I was making my rounds and thought that I heard talking coming from the bathroom. I went inside and heard whispering coming from the showers, so I walked towards them, and what I saw was just weird. I saw a young man around 17 or 20 years old, hunched over facing away from me in the darkest corner of the shower area. I walked towards him and said, "Hey man, I need you to get back to your bunk." And as I was approaching him, I swear to you that he just vanished into thin air in the blink of an eye. I remember feeling a pure shock and confusion. When I walked out, the other guy on watch asked me why I was so pale, and I told him what happened. I told him exactly what I had seen, and he said it was most likely a result of me being tired from all the stress of boot camp and the lack of sleep too. And to be honest, I agreed with him because I figured, why would a ghost haunt a shower at a boot camp of all places? And I was pretty tired that night as well. The next night, I didn't have to watch, but the recruit who had my usual shift reported seeing a shadow in the showers and some weird whispering noises while there was nobody there again. I talked to him too and told him what I had seen and that it was most likely our minds playing tricks on us because we're all tired. He agreed, and we decided that we should just ignore it. That was until I started seeing things outside the showers. I had a slightly earlier watch that night, and I was patrolling the bunks, just checking on recruits who were sick, as I'm supposed to. I was walking past some empty bunks and saw some movement in the corner of my eye. I figured it was some recruit messing around, so I go to tell them to get back into bed, but as I approach the empty bunks, I see some kind of a shadowy figure that didn't look humanoid at all. It was just like a black blob moving around. When I investigated it, it just vanished. The area that it was in was extremely cold too compared to the rest of the room. I just walked away as there was nothing to do there and figured that the staff must have cranked the air conditioning on and I was just tired making stuff up again. Mind you too, I saw this one out of the corner of my eye all throughout boot camp while on the early morning watch. Now, the last story from me was from when I was tasked with taking temperatures throughout the whole building. My job was to go to each division's compartment and ask for their room temperature. I had just taken all but 2 other divisions' temperatures and was looking for the last 2. As I walked past some empty rooms, I could have sworn that I saw movement inside. So I figured maybe I missed a room and I went back to look inside their window. The room was just being used as storage, I think, and was pitch black except for the light from outside. All I could see were some boxes and empty bunks, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw a person standing in the edge of the light facing me. I saw this too, and I decided at this point that I was just going to go look elsewhere for the last 2 rooms, which I found a few minutes later. However, as I was returning to turn in my readings, I noticed in the hallway a shadowy arm or limb being outstretched and coming back behind a doorway. And when I passed there was nothing, but the area that I was in was super cold again, and the room, it was just a closed janitorial closet. Also, the other recruit I previously mentioned spoke about seeing somebody dancing in the showers at night, but there being nothing when he investigated. He also said that one night he passed by the showers and saw someone peek out and disappear behind the wall. There was nobody there when he investigated, but he noted the area was really cold as well. Now, I know I'm going to get called a liar by some people and maybe an attention seeker and all that, but I know in myself that all of what I've said is true. I'm not in this for any sort of clout, nor do I seek to make the military look bad. I'm simply trying to find out what this all is, and what that recruit may have been dealing with too. Also, I cannot disclose as much information as I would like to because I could get in trouble with the chain of command and stuff, but if you have any ideas of what this all might be, then thank you in advance. So this happened to me in 2009. I was 22 at the time, but I'm very short and often mistaken for a young teen. I just had a driving lesson, and while normally my instructor would drop me off in front of my home at the end of our lessons, that day he had somewhere to be straight after, and he dropped me off at a nearby bus stop. My apartment block was about 500 meters away at the end of a long stretch of a quiet road. It was an area that was being built up at the time, so there were a couple of abandoned old houses to the left and the right, and my apartment block at the very end, and that was pretty much it. It was also rare to see cars there that weren't just going straight to the apartment block, because there was just nothing there, like I said. Except for a clinic a couple of streets away, so you would occasionally get someone who was lost or looking for directions, I suppose. But anyway, so it's around 8 p.m. and it just got dark outside. The street is barely lit, but it only takes a few minutes to get from the bus stop to my house, so I don't think anything of it. Until a car drives past me, but then starts backing up until it's driving slowly beside me. A woman is driving, and a man is in the passenger seat. I sort of slow down, thinking that they're going to ask me for directions to the clinic or something. The woman asks me, "Do you live here?" So now I'm thinking that they definitely want directions, and I stop and say yes. But then she says, "We are the police, and we're going to take you home." Mind you, this is a totally normal vehicle. These people aren't in uniform or look in any way official. I'm incredulous and literally so stunned, all I can say is something like, "You're joking, right?" Immediately I'm thinking that these people think that I'm like 10 and they're trying to kidnap me. The woman is starting to get agitated and keeps repeating, "You have to respect the police, get in the car and we'll take you home." I am so shocked, I'm like, "How dare you?" Partly offended that someone would think people are stupid enough to fall for this. But at this point, the car has stopped and I see the woman moving to open the door, so I just burst into the fastest sprint of my life while fumbling with my phone to call my mum, screaming before I even got to the block. "Buzz me in, I'm in danger." My dad went out to look for them immediately after, but the car was nowhere in the area. He informed the police, but unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. I've always been super creeped out by this story, though, and I often find myself wondering just what their intentions were. I'm glad that the story has a happy ending, obviously, but I often wonder if they maybe got somebody else instead of me. So I moved into a duplex with my ex about 3 years ago in what we thought was a safer part of the city. One of our neighbors, Amber, works in the duplex rental office, and her husband, Ed, was at the time fresh out of prison. Later, we would see all the swastika tattoos, and had been doing and continues to do landscape work for the rentals like mow the lawns, cut down trees, stuff like that. Other than that, though, he is home mostly doing odds and ends, things like tinkering with his mower or truck or something. But they both are super nice people, very kind and loving towards others, and always offer to help out. We've smoked together a few times. Ed smokes more than Amber, and have talked about all kinds of things, so I honestly thought that I could trust them and felt very safe being their neighbor. Now, I once mentioned how sometimes when I'm home alone, I hear steps in the attic over my room and what sounds like a chair being dragged. How sometimes the noise follows me around the house and always freaks me out to the point of calling someone just to feel a little bit safer until the noises die down. Ed said, "What? You think that we're spying on you?" In a laughing way, but it definitely creeps me out a bit. So then I break up with my boyfriend and he moves out. This is recent, so like a few months ago. Ed started texting me, asking if I wanted to smoke while Amber was still at work. I declined every time, finding different excuses because I still felt uncomfortable around him. And then he just flat out asked me if I wanted to do it with him because he thinks Amber is cheating on him. I definitely shut that down, and it was very awkward. I didn't tell Amber too because I didn't want to get kicked out or have some horrible awkward tension, and I hate confrontation, so I just kept quiet. But that's when I started to hear things in the attic above my room more often. It freaked me out even more when I woke up to a loud bang outside my room door at like 3 to 4 a.m. one morning. When I went to examine it, there was a small lockpick outside my door on the ground, but nobody around. I kept the lockpick, and the next day I texted a picture of it to Amber to let her know that I thought someone was creeping around, and she said, "Oh, that's Ed's. That's his ice pick and not a lockpick, sweetie. No one can pick your deadbolt with that." But I know the difference in a 4-inch skinny lockpick and an ice pick. I'm really scared to be alone here, though, especially at night. Our attics connect, and it's not outlandish to think that he could be up there spying on me. And just recently, I even found a freshly drilled hole in the ceiling of my room. I just put wadded up paper in it, and I try not to think about it. I honestly hope, too, that nothing comes of it, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. When I was in 8th and 10th grade, I was extremely involved in this small building server. The average age was probably 15 to 17, and I joined a group of builders and Skyped with them every weekend for hours. We all became close pretty quickly and trusted each other enough that we followed each other on Instagram. I became particularly close with one of the builders in my friend group. His name was Peter. Peter was actually in the same grade as me, and we ended up texting quite a lot. I heard rumors that Peter might have a crush on me. He denied them, which I found laughable because, it was the internet, and I brushed it off. Everything was fine for a while too, until something began to feel off when I talked to him. I was starting to constantly catch him telling small lies. This bothered me too, so I figured it was time to distance myself from Peter, and I stopped talking to him. Cut to a few months later of no contact, and Peter out of the blue texts me that he's going to be possibly transferring to my high school so he can get in-state tuition for college. But Peter's plan is to somehow live completely alone and support himself while in high school. My stomach drops when I read the text, and I know this feels very, very off. I try to be calm about it though, and I tell him that his plan is a bit crazy. I tell him that it's oddly convenient that he's close to my random suburb. Peter insists that his plan will work, and it's just a coincidence that he's going to my high school. I'm trying to call Peter's bluff and hoping that he's just messing with me because I cut him off. Peter says, though, that he bought the plane tickets already and is going to be staying in my town and to visit some high school in the area. Fear instantly washes over me, and I realize that Peter definitely has some very unhealthy attachment to me. Peter, he wasn't bluffing too. To my horror, he posts a picture on Snapchat at the airport. Peter asks to meet up while he's there, and I of course decline. Later I see on his Snapchat that he's taking a tour of my high school. Peter is also taking lots of videos and pictures, probably hoping that I see them. Luckily, I'm stuck at home with pneumonia, and I spend the next few days on edge and afraid that he was going to ring my doorbell at any moment. Luckily, he was not smart enough to find where I live, and he flies home and doesn't follow his plan. The baffling part, though, was that none of my old group on the Minecraft server thought that he did anything creepy. I felt like I was going crazy for thinking that this whole thing was weird. I thought my rejection for this meetup and continued no contact would be the end of it, but about 2 years later, and I just committed to my dream college, I still, stupidly, follow Peter on social media because I wanted some warning if he came to my area. And once again, Peter did just that. I see him posing in front of my library at my college with the caption saying, "Transferring here is definitely the move." Cut to a few months later, and Peter finds out that I have a boyfriend, and directly contacts me for the first time in like 2 years. He starts asking some strange questions too, like, will he protect you? I shouldn't have answered him, I know that, but for some reason I just did. I finally blocked him though, and I stopped following him on social media out of fear. He hasn't tried to contact me since then too, thankfully. I've definitely made some mistakes because I was young and scared, and I had others telling me that it wasn't a big deal, but I honestly think that I've had a stalker for the past few years. So I was watching 411 Hunters and was intrigued by a story in Ohio. I was watching the original documentary, and during the original there's a scene where there's a camp in an infinite symbol which reminded me of a childhood incident. So I was young, somewhere between 8 to 12 maybe, growing up in an area that's rural on the fringes of one of the cities. My cousin and I were outside playing with balsa wood gliders outside the front of the house, and my mother was in the basement doing the laundry. We had a robin's egg sky that summer day without a cloud in it, around 1 p.m. We were just having some fun throwing the gliders and chasing them and stuff, and eventually one of the gliders flew into the gutter located on the front of the house. It was no big deal. The house had a TV antenna attached to the house right next to the gutter, and we had been up on the roof many times before. So I started up the antenna, and my cousin had started climbing right behind me when, all of a sudden, the whole world just went completely white. All I could see was white, and the TV antenna kind of disappeared in my hands. And it didn't feel like looking at a flashlight or anything. It felt more like looking at a whiteboard, only this whiteboard was everywhere. I know I turned my head over my right shoulder to look at the source of the whiteout, and the source of the whiteness was sort of shaped like an infinite symbol made of tubing, and I could see different hues of blues and whites there. And then, all of a sudden, just as quickly as it came, it was gone. I then looked at my cousin, who was looking up at me. This strange calmness had flowed into us, and he just climbed down. I don't think we said much, if anything, to each other after that. But then my mother came freaking out through the front door, because she too saw the whiteness. It had lit up the basement through one of the windows, and she had thought that it was a lightning strike, but there was no thunder. And besides the antenna, there were 3 large trees, but nothing had been struck. I feel like I should add too that one night, I think in the fall, we also saw a large, low-flowing aircraft while at my cousin's house. I don't know if it was the same year as the whiteboard, but his house was maybe like 2 miles from mine. Also, I'm much older now, and I'm well versed in electrical engineering, multiple manufacturing trades and technologies, and I've always been an avid outdoorsman, and this whole thing, I still can't explain it. This is truly the scariest and most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. I've never been so petrified in my life, and to this day I still don't know who that man was, what he was trying to do, or if he's still where I saw him. Also, I'm sorry for how long the geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if it wasn't for my parents. So I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home was, still is too, just outside of a small town with forests all around. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from the river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a kid. I knew the forest there well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream and stuff. The walk I go on always led me off the path, which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, and then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles' walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in these forests for sure, because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone, or with my dad over the span of like 18 years, and we never saw anybody else in the forest. I went there twice that summer too, both times alone-ish I would say. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the pathway from the stream to the sharp bend, then come back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so, and as I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which obviously I found strange. I listened well, wondered if it was just a lost hunting dog, and started moving towards the sound. Yes, I know, I'd be the first person to die in a movie, but I was heading north anyway, so what the heck, right? I realized that it couldn't have been an animal pretty quickly though, because I could tell the bell was too heavy, because of how clear the sound was, to be on a collar. I kept moving though, and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big enough or strong enough to carry a bell. That could have been enclosed in a tin or something, I suppose. And the river was too far still. I thought of everything, but nothing explained the sound. Apart from one obvious thing, which I just didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew, too, that it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it, and I just walked on normally, until I found a badger, a dead one, carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh, and the body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, though, but I knew that happened soon after the exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, and so had I. Which meant that the badger was put there, maybe killed there, or at least decapitated while I was walking that way. I suppose. Don't know, really. But nothing else happened that day. But 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and that would be my last time ever. So I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, then decided to go back the way that I came because it was getting late and it was raining quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. and I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly too, and it was the decomposing body of the badger with his head strung to his front paws. That area looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just the swinging from a tree, and it was just this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I couldn't help it. I had some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair too, and it was just repulsive. At first, I just sort of stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently because I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain too, but my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river, so someone had strung up the body after I had passed it on the way there, which probably meant that someone knew that I would see it. So, was someone watching me and running through the forest? Were the faint sounds of branches breaking around me not animals? I looked around, and then I started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back towards the path for a while when I heard that same bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part of the path to me to go as fast as he could, and that someone was in this forest. I can't explain the feeling that I had too. It was honestly like I just dropped my intestines in my stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise despite being soaked. It was completely dark, and I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away. Just too far to feel safe, that is. It was still raining, and every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than before. The bell went on for way longer than the last time too, on and off. I felt like it was surrounding me at one point. I think it was the fear combined with my compromised hearing, and the fact that I couldn't breathe properly was making me slightly lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't really sure what I was even doing. And at this point, I was breathing like a horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mum, who was on her way with my dad, and I kept hearing sounds, but I wasn't sure what they were. My mum was screaming on the phone at the time that they were on the path, that I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I just went into survival mode. I was doing the half running, half speed walking thing again because I was completely out of breath now. And then I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and the bell ringing really loud now. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder, and that was when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach, and I could tell that he was staring straight at me. Now, I don't know if I had hidden secret sprinting abilities or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you that I ran for my life, I am not kidding. I didn't look back once, and I screamed as much as I could. I lied and said that I'm on the phone with the police, they're on the path. Dad, I can see you, I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that to myself, obviously. And to be honest, I felt like something awful was going to happen. I felt like that man was right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck. And then I just switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in my car. I felt like my phone was my only ticket to home. And weirdly, things just no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't even know if the man was still following me, because at this point I could only hear my heart beating in my ears and that bell. But then I finally heard my dad shout my name, and I knew that he was coming my way, and that he could see me because of the intonation of his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got to each other. My dad heard the bell too, and my mum could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car ready to leave fast, and when we got back, we went directly to the police station, and I got medical attention soon after. My dad burst into tears in the car, said that he could hear the bell and that he thought that he wouldn't be able to see me, asked what if I didn't have my phone, and what if he hadn't picked up. Quite honestly, they were almost as terrified as me because they witnessed everything through the call. They could hear me trying to run, and they could hear the danger, they just couldn't see it. Unfortunately, the police couldn't really do much. They searched the area, and the only thing that they found was a folded t-shirt placed under a rock. I didn't really question that at the time, but my bag wasn't recovered, unfortunately. They said that it was probably some homeless man living in the forest, but failed to realize what could have happened if my dad didn't know that part of the forest like I did, and where to find me. I'm not blaming anyone or anything. The entire thing was my fault. I'll happily admit that. But there are just so many what ifs. I want to believe that it was just someone who decided to live in the woods and hunt for something. Maybe they were a bit mentally unstable and they felt angry that I came into their territory, but what if it was more insidious? I mean, the way that he moved towards me was abnormal. It was perverse because of how slowly he was ringing the bell, too. It was like he had me trapped and he knew it. I didn't see any more details after that, though, because I just ran. To this day, I can't go anywhere where I'll be alone, and the sound of bells are a real problem, the smell of moss as well. But my parents, and probably Steve Jobs too, saved my life that day. So go hug yours now and take decapitated badges and bells as pagan signs that you're very unwelcome. So back in 2007 or 2008, I was 16 when this began, 18 or 19 when it finally went to court. Picture a Norman Rockwell-esque suburban family. Parents, 3 kids, a yard and a dog, in Blink and You'll Miss It USA. One random day, a neighbor man has a mild dispute with his neighbor. As a totally warranted response, a neighbor man, NM from here on out, takes every hose that he has and floods their yard. Solid decisions lead to solid consequences, so naturally, he was fined for water waste. My parent runs the water in small-town USA, and because NM lived a block from us, he decided to drive over to the water district shouting that he is an acquaintance of my parent. Second solid decision of many to come from NM. Absolutely no one takes kindly to name-dropper folks, so tuck that gem away under life facts. But my parent comes in and tells him, even if his kids did this, they would have the same repercussions, gracefully glossing over the fact that, other than maybe driving by one another, none of us have actually ever interacted with NM. NM repeats the name of the man working the front desk as well as my parents' name and claims it's now personal, and storms out. My family members and I began to see NM at random places, constantly, the DMV, grocery store, our respective jobs. Apparently, when you're cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and your parents pay for your house, you have all kinds of time to stalk, right? Anyway, I went from random sightings while out and about to phone calls pretty quickly. The cliche 90s type of call, breathe, hang up sort of thing, and I can see you variety. At this point, NM was more of an annoyance than scary, to be honest, but as I've stated, when you underestimate crazy, you lose every time. And NM began parking across from our house, staying there from like 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., literally just sitting in his car, blasting music, staring at the house. The fool must have had the determination and bladder of a racehorse because, I mean, who sits there for like 10-ish hours like that? His music was trash too. Maybe he was a masochist and into self-harm. I don't know. But seeing how long he suffered through terrible music and a full bladder like that, I doubt anyone with a semi-rational concept of social interactions could fathom why. And this went on for like 3-4 times a week to a nightly occurrence. And imagine being a 16-year-old female that doesn't even feel comfortable to change in her room because of the prospect that he might see through the blinds somehow, trying to sleep, knowing that he was out there. We were prisoners in our very own home. Soon, too, he began to get bolder. NM drove his car speeding and up onto the sidewalk at my sibling and her partner while they were on the sidewalk out front coming home from a date. But they both had to physically jump out of the way to avoid being hit. He also made lewd gestures at me when I brought my dog out for a walk and was waiting for my sibling to come out and join us on the walk. It was so bad, too, that I ended up crying and just going inside. This had been going on for a year at this point. The cops always said the same thing too. There's nothing we can do unless there's a threat made against you or someone is harmed, blah blah blah. My parent confronted NM in the street after my incident too, to which NM called the cops and they came asking us while we were harassing him and threatening NM. I'll never understand why the system waits until you're a victim rather than prevents someone from being victimized, but anyway, that's for another time. Almost 2 years in and it's Christmas time now, and my parent has a brain aneurysm. Fortunately, they made it through without any lingering effects, which is extremely rare. I convinced my other parent, who had been living at the hospital with their sick partner, to come home and shower and eat and stuff. And at about 9 p.m, we get a knock at the door. A random man in ratty clothes holding a Christmas present says that he's there to deliver this to the family name. We ask who sent him, and he says that he can't say. We ask who he works for, and he shoves the gift at my parent and just leaves. We're obviously uncomfortable to open it, but my parent decides that they need to know what's in it, and they open the present. Inside is a 17-page document of the grounds on why NM is suing my parent that was currently in hospital. Even if I could tell that it was fake with the grammatical errors and typos, NM took the time to sit and type all of this up himself, thinking that it would scare us. The document and the fake details he put in did not. The fact this 40-something-year-old man was so fixated on our family that he sat and typed a 17-page fake document, that was the part that scared us. Things progressed though, and NM began pacing in front of his car and pretending to have phone calls where he would talk about pushing my parent down the stairs or knowing where we kids went to school and worked and how easy it would be to access us at any time. At the time, I worked a closing shift that let me off at about 1 a.m. He would be parked next to my car and he would then follow me home. One time, I even tried to take random roads and he still stayed right behind me, pulling up to the house with NM parked across the street, I think neighborhood street with maybe 5 feet between a car parked on one side and one on the other, and having to get out and run to the door was an absolute nightmare. We were all exhausted though from not only the aneurysm scare, but also living looking over our shoulders all the time. My parents' friend told her friend, who is a DA, a district attorney, about the situation. She called and came over and took our case on pro bono. And testifying was a wild ride, let me tell you. We had to put in official statements prior to being called to the stand, and we weren't allowed to be in the room when a family member was testifying, nor were we allowed to talk in the halls as we waited for our turn. And imagine reliving 2+ years of traumatic experiences, being cross-examined where you're made out to be a liar, and then not able to have your family comfort or support you afterwards was definitely not ideal. There was enough to put him away for 1.5 years though, as well as a grant of felony restraining orders, and we moved while he was still incarcerated. My sister passed while he was in prison, and he immediately tried to sue her estate. She was 21 at her death when he was released. He claimed that her testimony from him running his car at her and her partner was false and the only reason he was locked up, and not the case as there were harassment and stalking charges too, and that the money that people donated to a GoFundMe for her accident, he was apparently entitled to. There's so many more details too, but this is already getting pretty long and I think you get the drift. But anyway, it was a scary time for me and I'm glad that, well, for the most part, it's over. This encounter took place at the hotel that I worked at last year. I was 20 years old working at a small mom-and-pop hotel in Ontario, California. I had worked there for some time before I had started to stay there for a few months. But the owner taught me too everything that I needed to know so I could run his business while he went on a business trip to Africa. Mind you, I didn't have a car, so my only option was to stay there and work around the clock if need be. The good news, though, was that I didn't have to pay for the room, and I got to wash my clothes in the laundry room for free. There was a grocery store in walking distance too, and restaurants all around me where I could get food at a discounted price since I worked at the hotel. And quite honestly, I thought it was a sweet deal. Now, one night, my boyfriend came down to visit, and while he was in the bathroom, I heard banging coming from the room next to ours. Then I heard scratching on my walls. I told him to stop playing, and he didn't even know what I was talking about, though. The banging continued all night, so I called the front desk and told them that the people next to me were loud and I had to be up at 6 to go down there to work. But she was quiet for a while, and then told me that she hadn't rented out that room next to mine. Mind you, I also had an end room. I quickly ran outside to see if the curtains were open or closed, and they were open. I could see right into that room, and nobody was in there. This was an outside hotel, and I had never been so creeped out in my life, to be honest. And so, in the end, I decided to sage the room to rid any of it of bad spirits or energy and that stuff, and that seemed to work for a while, until it just didn't. The next time, I swear to you that something demonic happened. I was asleep, and I kept hearing whispers in my sleep. I hate whispers with a passion, and they sort of creep me out, even at the best of times, so I sat up in bed and I was looking around the dark room, and in the corner of the room I saw white glowing eyes staring at me. I felt frozen by its glare. I could see its body and saw that it was crouched down holding its knees. Then I saw more shadows appearing closer and closer. I reached to turn on the lamp next to the bed, and it didn't cut on. So my next thought was that I needed to run outside and get to safety. It took all the balls in the world for me to get up and run outside. I was so scared that I couldn't even feel my legs. All I could feel were the cold wooden floorboards beneath me. I got to the door and flung it open, only to see that the bedroom curtains were on the outside of my room's window. The sky was black and the clouds were a dark, dark green with grey tints. I was mortified to realize that I must have still been asleep and I hadn't actually woken up yet. I looked back inside the hotel room and saw myself asleep in the bed. I screamed bloody murder, and then that's when I jolted awake for real. After that, I said a prayer, and eventually I got back to sleep. But the encounter that followed was worse. I went back to sleep, and yet again I could hear things in my sleep. I was scared, and I couldn't move any of my body. I started to pray in my head as loud as I could, only to awake and feel my body slam on the bed as if I was levitating. After that, I called my grandma the next day, and she said that it was a demonic attack. I got in my car shortly after a few days later, and I never stayed in that hotel ever again. I was also severely depressed at the time I was staying there, and I don't know, maybe that attracted something because I've heard other people say something similar. But I never stayed there again, and to be honest, I never intend to again.